Hanukkah. It's Christmas. Everything comes together in this day. And Shavua Tov, a good week. Parasha Vayeshev. What is the point of Jacob asking to be tranquil, to be quiet, to be settled? Finally, after all his travels and his problems with Laban and 20 years of working for him and 2 wives and now 12 sons, thank God, and 1 daughter, problematic all the way around, daughter that gets raped by Shem, a whole town that gets wiped out for her honor, all the men get killed. Not really exactly a very quiet kind of life, but then who has a quiet kind of life. At the age of 17, this parsha begins speaking about Yosef angering his brothers. What happened before? Well, as sibling rivalry, it doesn't really come out until all the parties are in great understanding. Of course, he's got older brothers. And here is the 17-year-old, the second youngest, the most loved of all of Yaakov's children, because he was the firstborn of his beloved wife, Rachel. Rachel. And he's a guy special, obviously special, to the point where his father makes him a beautiful coat, which everybody, of course, was very jealous about because, look, he talked about them, he brought bad news about them to Yaakov, he told what was going on between the brothers, the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, and the sons of Rachel and Leah. So you have 4 mothers. And he brought news to Yaakov that Yaakov needed to know, obviously. But the boys didn't like that. And then he talked about his dreams. And he told his brothers about it, and they hated him even more. And this is what he said to them. Please listen to this dream which I have dreamed. There were binding sheaves in the middle of the field, and look, my sheaves stood upright, and it kept standing too, and then look, your sheaves gathered around and threw themselves down in front of my sheaves. And the brother said to him, does this mean that you want to reign constantly over us, rule over us all the time? And then he had another dream. And here I dreamed that just the sun and the moon and 11 stars threw themselves down before me. And his father said, what? In order to calm the brothers down, he said to Yosef, what is this dream that you have dreamed? How could I, your mother, and your brothers come and throw ourselves down before you on the ground when your mother has already passed away? But the brothers were still envious. They decide that this goes too far. He doesn't need to be around. He needs to be killed. And here comes a very interesting series of events, because here you have the 12 tribes. You have basically every single Jew ever lived, ever born, ever will live, ever will be born. And here you have guys who are looking to kill their brother. And, you know, one of them says, Reuben says, no, let's not kill him. Let's not have blood on our hands. Let's just simply put him into a pit. And yeah, there are snakes and there are scorpions in the pit, but you know, at least we won't kill him. Well, it's not an easy thing to go and kill your brother. You put him into a pit, uh, then you do tshuva, and Reuben is really the first one who does tshuva, because he is not for this killing business at all. And he's also the one we have to remember that he's the oldest, and he's got the most sense of all of them. But it doesn't really work, because the boys made up their mind, the men made up their mind, this is going to be it. And they see that there is a caravan, and so they decide, instead of killing him, they'll sell him. In other words, there is a lot of stuff going on between the brothers, a lot of conversation about what should be done in this case. And ultimately, really, they don't want to kill him. They sell him. They send the coat with blood from a sheep to his father. His father is absolutely devastated, completely devastated, and he will not be consoled under any circumstances. And here you have this conversation. Yaakov is asking for, let me already be settled after all this life that I've lived. And here comes the greatest of all of his pains. His beloved Joseph is gone. And the brothers have a shvur, they have a vow between them that no one, absolutely no one tells Yosef, tells Yaakov what happened to Yosef, and that they actually sold him, and what went on. In other words, it's a story, but it's not a story because it goes on all the time, and we live in a world, we live in a time where brothers kill each other, fathers kill their sons. There is a world, and when you listen to the news every day, it becomes scarier and scarier to see what human beings are capable of doing to each other. But here comes the really big, big story. And that is that ultimately what we decide and our free choice and our trying to do things in a certain way, thinking that we are doing what we are doing. And in reality, we're not. Because in Joseph's case, Hashem was with him. And no matter what he did from the time that he got to Egypt, obviously, he becomes the head officer of Potiphar's home. He is the chief of the butchers. He is just a very important man in the country, and he loves Joseph, and he gives Joseph absolutely his whole entire estate to take care of whatever he wants, and Joseph loves it. He's pampering himself. He has handsome features and a beautiful complexion, says the Torah. And God says to him, you are pampering yourself while your father's is mourning. I will incite the bear against you. What does that mean? I will incite the bear against you. Well, very shortly thereafter, as a matter of fact, immediately thereafter, Potiphar's wife takes a great liking to Joseph, and she goes after him, and he says no, and she doesn't stop, and he says no, and she is extremely wicked, and she wants to speak to him day in and day out, and he wouldn't listen to her. And then things move in a different way because there is a holiday and he needs to go home, and she wants to sleep with him. And there is a beautiful, beautiful midrash that Yosef is actually falling for it. But at the moment that his mind is moving in that direction, he sees the image of his father. And he runs, she grabs him, and he leaves his clothing. And of course, that's what she's been waiting for. And now she is going to go after him. The Hebrew slave that you brought us came to deprave me. And then when I raised my voice and screamed, he left his clothes with me and he dashed off outside. And Potiphar, of course, believed his wife, and Yosef is thrown into prison. So here is the bear. Went right after Yosef, didn't kill him, but put him into prison for a very long time, except that with all of the bad things, here is Hashem, and again, God was with Yosef, and he granted him a favorable image and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the prison warden delivered all the captives that were in the prison into Joseph's hand, everything that was done through his command. And the prison warden didn't see any fault in anything that was in Joseph's hands. And that was because God was with him and God made him successful. So even in the misery of being in prison, there is Hashem's hand taking care of who needs to be taken care of. And in our particular case, it's Joseph. Then, here come your dreams again. Dream of the chief butcher and dream of the gentleman who brings the wine. And it becomes very interesting when we look at dreams. And sometimes dreams tell us truth, and sometimes they don't. And in this particular case, Yosef sees the two guys in the morning and he says, "Why are you depressed? What's going on? I mean, everything is great and wonderful for Joseph, but these two guys just had dreams and they don't know what to do with them." So the first one says, "I had a dream, and in my dream, look, a vine was before me, and on the vine there were 3 tendrils, and it seems to be blossoming, and its buds came out, and then it clustered and ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, and I squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I placed the cup on Pharaoh's palm." And Joseph gave him the interpretation. "In another 3 days, the Pharaoh will count his officers to serve him at a meal, and he will count your head and restore you to your position. And then you, the butler, will again be at the Pharaoh's side. And when that happens, will you remember me, please, to the Pharaoh? Because I was kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews, and I've done nothing wrong here, and they put me into prison." The chief baker was also very impressed with that, and he said, "Listen, in my dream, I was there and there were 3 wicker baskets on my head, and the upper baskets, they were being eaten by the birds." And Yosef replied, "This is the interpretation. 3 baskets, 3 days. In another 3 days, Pharaoh will remove your head and hang you on the gallows, and the birds will eat your flesh off." And that happened within 3 days. The butler was restored. But of course, he didn't remember Yosef. And the baker was hung. Depends very much on who interprets your dreams. And Zohar says, don't allow anyone to interpret your dream unless you're very close to them and you know who they are to you, because a bad interpretation can lead to a bad outcome. This is a very difficult parsha because there is a great deal of moral implication in this parsha. And I see in my own way of thinking, I see many different ways that this could be interpreted, because we have brothers, we have patriarch, we have not just your everyday people here, you know. These are the leaders of our nation. These are the genes, they are the blood that flows in our veins. It's not easy to think that here are 11 brothers, and there are 10 that decide to kill the 11th. Benjamin is still with Yaakov, he's too young. And these are all tzaddikim. They're all righteous. Every single one of them is considered righteous. Yaakov sends Yosef into the fields to look for their brothers, and he knows that the brothers are not fond of Yaakov. He knows that, and he sends him anyway. How does that work? Well, when Hashem decides, and he comes into our heads, and he puts ideas into our heads, and he gives us instruction, and we listen to that inner voice. Sometimes we don't have a choice except to do what our inner voice tells us and what God tells us. It's very interesting that Rashi is talking about, why did God not reveal to Yaakov that Joseph was alive? And the answer is because the brothers excommunicated and cursed anyone who would reveal it, and they included God as a partner with them. Yitzchak, however, knew that he was alive, but he said, how can I reveal it to Yaakov if God does not wish to reveal it to him? And the Midrash says, they said, let's make a vow of excommunication amongst us that no one will tell Yaakov our father. Judah said to them, Reuben is not here, and a vow of excommunication is only valid in the presence of 10 men. What did they do? They included God as a partner with them in their vow of excommunication, not to tell their father. Thus, even God did not tell Yaakov because of the vow, Tachuma, too. Can you imagine? It's unbelievable what they did and through what extent, to what extent they knew that what they did was not right, but they couldn't help themselves because that was destiny. It was Hashem's desire for it to be so. Inside all of this goings on, of course, there is already the conversation of Egypt. There is already the conversation of exile. There is already the conversation of what happens, because as long as a tzaddik is alive in a generation, evil cannot befall the Jewish people. So here we have Yaakov. And when Yaakov dies, Yitzchak dies, of course, Yaakov dies, and eventually Yosef dies, and not until Yosef dies do the Jewish people go into exile. Everything is already set up. Just like in our lives today, just as in our lives today, everything is already set up. We think we've got it all in hand. We think that everything that we do is our decision. We think not of God. You know, on Friday, 23rd, the United Nations passed a resolution. America, our greatest friend, since 1948, since the inception of our country, Israel, has been our greatest friend. And in the last days, 25 days, I believe, to the inauguration of a new president, this president vetoes, or let's say abstains from his power and basically goes against Israel. It sounds to me like everything was great while Pharaoh was in the good graces with, or I should say, Joseph was in good graces with the Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh really gave him everything and made him grander than great. And then another one comes along and he says, well, who are you? I really don't know you, and I really don't care, and it doesn't make any difference to me, and go. Ultimately, what changes history? Ultimately, what? God changes history. inside Vayeshev, inside this Parsha, there is the story of Yehuda and Tamar. And the classic question is, why is the story of Yehuda and Tamar written here? And Rashi answers, why was this section placed here where it interrupts the section dealing with Yosef? To teach us that Yehuda's brothers demoted him from his high position when they saw their father's distress about, of course, about Yosef. They said, you told us to sell him. If you would have told us to return him to his father, we would have listened to you. You know, interesting, no? But again, the story is exactly the same. Reuben puts him into the pit. Yehuda wants to sell him. Ultimately, that's what happens. Ultimately, they pull him out of the pit. Neither the scorpions nor anything that was in there, snaky or otherwise, even touched Yosef. They pulled him out, they sold him to one, he gets sold to the other, he winds up with Potiphar, he winds up great, he winds up in prison. In other words, what are we talking about? So the Midrash says, the brothers were busy selling Joseph. Joseph was busy with Yosef was busy with sackcloth and fasting. Reuben was busy with sackcloth and fasting. Yaakov was busy with sackcloth and fasting. Judah was busy finding himself a wife. And God was creating the light of Melech HaMashiach. And this refers to Peretz, the ancestor of Mashiach, who was born from the union of Yehuda and Tamar. Is this a soap opera? But does this make absolutely perfect sense in the way that we live our lives and the things that we go through as a people? The story of Yehuda and Tamar is an interesting one. It's a great story in and of itself. Why? Because Yehuda loses the respect of his brothers because they blame him for the entire incident with Joseph. Not true. They were all against Joseph, but when it comes down to the things, you're always looking for a scapegoat. And there are deaths of sons of Judah that weren't any good. And then Yehudah's wife, Shua's daughter, it's a very interesting thing here because women ultimately are so important. Women always think that they've got, a second part in the Torah and that it's all about men. Well, it's not, because if it weren't for Tamar, there would be no parents. And, the idea of levirate marriage is a very interesting one. But in this particular case, if you read the Parsha, the various husbands, the various sons of Judah die because they weren't any good, and God takes them away. So there is the father-in-law and Tamar wanted a child from Judah. And she took off her widow's clothing. She covered her head with a scarf, covered her face, and she sat herself down at the crossroads. And there is the conversation of Judah. He's the harlot, and he goes and he says, come with me. And she says, well, what will you give me? And he gives her the signet ring, and he gives her the cloak, and he gives her the staff. And then they are together. She conceives, she gets pregnant. And of course, everybody knows, hey, here is this woman who is not married. She becomes pregnant. She was a harlot. And Yehuda says, out, she has to be burned. At which point she produces what she produces: a cloak, a staff, a signet ring. And Judah is a man of his word, and he said, yes, that is mine. But he didn't continue to be intimate with her anymore. And then comes the birth of Peretz and Sarah. And again here, it's a very, very important thing that happens. And the classic question, why did Sarah not succeed in becoming the firstborn, even though he began to emerge first? And Rashi says, 4 hands are written here, corresponding to the 4 violations against prohibited property committed by Achan, who was a descendant of Serach. Another opinion is that they corresponded to the 4 things that he looted from the spoil of Jericho: a cloak from Sinar, 2 pieces of silver worth 200 shekels, and a wedge of gold. Now, we won't go into this. Remember this when we come to this conversation. But there is a reason for absolutely everything. And because Mashiach arises from Peretz, since Mashiach is associated with Teshuvah, repentance, to the extent that he will influence tzaddikim to Teshuvah, meaning those who are righteous will do Teshuvah. This is also hinted to the name Peretz, which indicates breaking the boundaries, a task which is crucial to the process of Teshuvah. So the conversation of going beyond the limitations, going above and beyond what you can do, comes already in the womb. Peretz was the firstborn, alluding to the fact that the Baal Tshuva is higher than the Tzaddik. However, Serach's hand emerged first, indicating that initially a person should endeavor to be a tzaddik. But since Achan was destined to come from Serach too needed to recognize the advantage of tshuva, and so it was that Peretz who emerged first. In other words, everything that we see, everything that we learn, everything that we put together here, from the beginning of the Torah until the end, and every parsha in between, is absolutely thought out and planned meticulously to teach us and guide us how we need to live our lives, and how we need to look at the signs, and how we need to look at the signposts, and how careful we have to be with the way we behave ourselves, how incredibly careful we have to be to look around us and sometimes not see exactly what it is that we want to see, but look just a tad at someone else in another way, at a situation in another way. Look, life is hard. Being righteous, doing the right thing, is incredibly difficult. But we have to try. We have to go beyond our limitations. Beyond our limitations, in order to break the boundaries. Latchila ariba, above and beyond. And this is what connects us in this parsha, this day, to Hanukkah. Because more than 2,100 years ago, when the Hellenists tried to destroy our Torah, to take it out of our minds, to make us forget the word of Hashem, the Hashmonaeans, nothing of an army, nothing of being trained, nothing of knowledge of military, but the burning desire and the love of Hashem and the love of Torah to fight against the enemy, re-establish the temple, take oil, look for oil that is tahor, that is clear and clean and kosher and sealed, even though under the circumstances they could have used regular oil, but they didn't want to. Again, above the limitations, looking and searching in a destroyed temple, and finding just one flask that's to last one day, that lasts 8 days. 8 above and beyond the limitation of 7. And we celebrate this day, these days of light, for saving us again, Hashem, from oblivion of not knowing and not understanding Torah. You should have a beautiful, lichtig, lighted Hanukkah. Our lights should liven up the world, starting in our home, illuminating our home, each Jewish home all over the world, to remind us of the miraculous victory culminating in the rededication of the sanctuary in Jerusalem and rekindling the menorah, which had been desecrated by the enemy, and bringing us back to Torah, to light, to every day of Hashem's service. What privilege we have to be His chosen people. Chag Sameach. See you next week.